Can I invite the Honourable Mick Veitch, the Honourable Mark Latham, the Honourable Sarah Mitchell and the Honourable Susan Carter to each take a seat on the stage. Now, we have had a late change to our lineup this afternoon. Ms. Kate Fairman has had to send her apologies, her sincere apologies, so we'll be missing Kate. And in her place, thank you so much, Susan Carter. You've heard from Susan this morning as she chaired the panel discussion on constitutional law. You are an absolute champion, stepping into the breach at the last minute this afternoon. We do understand you need to get away at 4:40, so we will excuse you to slip off at that time. Can I just emphasise to members of the audience and those joining us online that notwithstanding Kate Fairman's apology today, we have ensured throughout the Bicentenary program that our panels of members have represented the entirety of the political spectrum across the course of the last year, including both the major parties, the so-called Conservative crossbench and the so-called Progressive crossbench. I have a number of, questions on notice, Dorothy Dix questions to ask the members of the panel, but we will also ensure that there are opportunities for questions from the floor, and I'm anticipating some interaction between the members of the panel. One final note of housekeeping. It's really a message both to the audience and also to the members. Although we're here in Parliament House, in the Parliament building, this is not a proceeding in Parliament. So the protection of parliamentary privilege does not apply as you ask your questions or as you provide your comments. Can I begin by inviting each of our panel members, perhaps starting with Mr. Veitch, to introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about your story and how it was that you came to be a member of the Legislative Council.
Well, thank you, David. And welcome to all and to my fellow panel members. It's good to see you all again. My journey to the New South Wales Upper House was a bit different. I come through the Labor Party. I was a former shearer, foster parent, had worked in the disability sector for a number of years, had been told on a couple of occasions that I wouldn't make Parliament within the party, that I wouldn't get to the Upper House. So the day that I got to walk into the chamber and take my seat before signing in, I had a good look around and thought to myself, I used to work in a tin shed and I'm back in a tin shed, just slightly more salubrious. My reflections upon walking into the chamber itself was, people can romanticise these things, but for someone who had been told they weren't going to get there, who was there, I wasn't going to waste my time. I was going to do what I could within the party structures, but then also within the standing orders and arrangements of the Upper House. I don't know, I may have pushed back occasionally, David, on some of those structures and processes, and in the end I decided the best way to do that is try to work with some others across the chamber and achieve things. And so my early reflections are, it was a place where I could represent and speak for those who weren't there or who couldn't get there, whether they be shearers from the other side of Burke or people living with a disability in their life. And so I try to shape as much of my time in the House through that context.
Thank you very much. Sarah Mitchell.
So I was elected in 2011. I came in, I'm a member of the Nationals. I live in Gunnedah up near Tamworth, so come down from the regions to be here in Parliament. I got in on the very big landslide election in 2011, and I was number 11 on the upper house ticket for the Liberals and Nationals, which has never been elected before, so I really probably shouldn't be here, but 13 years later I'm still here. I've been re-elected again, so it's okay. So for me it was a really interesting period of time. So I was 28 when I got elected in the Nationals and a woman, which was a little bit different in and of itself, to be frank. So it was a good opportunity, I guess, for me to bring that perspective of being someone a little bit younger, and at that stage in my life, my husband and I, we got married 2 weeks after the election, so literally within a 4-week period, we got married, we moved house, and I became an MP, and we're still married, so again, that bodes well. But it was a process for me. I'd been a political staffer, not ever in Canberra, not ever ministerial. I used to work, my first boss was John Anderson, worked for him out of Gunnedah, and I really genuinely, a bit like Mick, I love living in the country, and I wanted to make life better for people who lived in my community. And at that time, we'd had many, many years of a Labor government, and it felt like a lot of the state services, I guess we weren't maybe getting our fair share in the bush, and so I wanted to be a part of making my community a place that I wanted to live in, and hopefully one day raise a family in. And that was sort of my genesis for putting my hand up. And I remember when I got in here, I was quite overwhelmed at the beginning, because it was never like it was a chance that I would get elected, but until that literally day that they pushed the button, and it was myself, Jeremy Buckingham and Pauline Hanson were the last three for the 2 spots that were there, and I managed to get the last spot. So it took me a little while when I first came in to really get my head around the fact that I was an MP, that I had a job to do. And so when I think back to 2011, it's the first probably 6 months or so, I think my head was spinning a lot until I kind of worked out what my role was and got my feet under the desk and got cracking.
Thank you. Susan Carter.
Thank you, David. So I am very new. This is my first term. I was elected in March 2023. I had long been interested in politics because of policy, and I think, like Sarah, I want to make sure that the society I live in is a good society in which everybody can thrive. And I suppose through the lens of being a parent, you want to build a society in which your children can thrive. I had worked for a number of years in the law and in legal education in universities. I'm in the Liberal Party. I'd been actively involved in the Liberal Party. I'd offered myself for pre-selection, and the pre-selectors had decided that they weren't interested. And so I thought, well, there's plenty of different ways that you can serve. And then I had the opportunity for the March 2023 election, and it's an extraordinary privilege to find myself here and find myself hopefully being able to contribute to making New South Wales a really good place for everybody to live.
Thank you. And Mark Latham.
Yeah, thanks, David. I had local government and federal parliamentary experience beforehand, and after I left the federal parliament in 2005, one of the best experiences of my life was being the home parent, predominantly raising the 3 kids. But as they grew up and it got to the point where I was losing too many political arguments at home, I thought I needed to go to a place where I can win some, maybe, and had a few options to get onto the crossbench of the upper house and took them up, which I've enjoyed because unlike a major party where you're the spokesperson on Treasury or education, you can actually roam across the issues that you think are relevant, pick them out and hopefully make a difference, either in a negative or a constructive sense, according to the work of the crossbench. Obviously I was a long-standing member of the Labor Party, but primarily over identity politics instead of the focus on socio-economic issues that I grew up with in Liverpool and Green Valley. Grew disillusioned with that, and the crossbench is sort of a movable feast, a bit of a circus at times, and you can pick out your political configuration and issues as you see fit. But generally, I suppose my attitude about politics and probably my public life has been that I've always lived in southwest Sydney and have had a habit of moving from Liverpool to Campbelltown out beyond Camden. As the urban fringes moved out, I've wanted to stay on the edge and right on the fringe, and that's a sort of a descriptor of my political existence as well, that one way or another I'm comfortable with. I've always liked it that way. I've never wanted to be part of the establishment, and I suppose I'm living proof that that'll never happen.
Thank you. Thanks for those introductions. What was it like when you first arrived? So Mick Veitch, you arrived in 2007.
So the political context, and Mark, as a former member of the Labor Party, will appreciate this. The Labor caucus room has a mystique about it. There's people talk about what the party room is like, and so on my first day, you go into the party room, and I looked at it. So in 2007, it would be fair to say that my first party room meeting was a room that thought they were going to lose the 2007 election, but actually won the 2007 election with that great political slogan of all time. And we're heading in the right direction, but there's more to do. It won us the election. And so I walked into a room where there was that sort of vibe. Now, from there, going into we have MLC caucuses, and so you have a chat, meet with your people in the upper house, and they sort of guide you through what's going to happen when you walk into the chamber, and it's where you're going to sit, and then to walking into the chamber. It's just that whole morning is a blur, but the political context for me was it was the Labor Party winning an election that they didn't think they were going to win. Many would say probably shouldn't have won, and sort of the characters were there in that caucus at that time. It was exciting. It was I wouldn't say scary, but some of the characters could be if you wanted them to be. And it was just a mix of emotions on the day, David. And then going into the chamber and that whole, if anyone's never seen the opening of the Parliament or the chamber on the first day, you should really take that in. There's a bit of theatre and around all of that. But that whole process was quite exciting.
Thank you. Sarah Mitchell, you've sort of hinted at this a little. What was it like for you in 2011?
Yeah, so I suppose from the coalition side, we were almost the beneficiaries of you guys winning the election you maybe should have lost, because we won in a big way in 2011. And so I remember coming in to that, as I said, that first party, the Nats, we'd won, I think, nearly every regional seat. The Liberal Party, I'm sure they won't mind me saying, had won seats that I don't think they ever thought that they would win either, and maybe only kept for that term between 2011 and 2015. But there were big numbers of coalition members. We did have, I think we only needed 2 votes to get through legislation in from 2011 in the upper house as well. So at the moment, I think we're looking at sort of 7 votes to get anything through. Really back then it was about negotiating mainly with the Christian Democratic Party. I was a backbencher then, I didn't do any of that sort of stuff. But Parliament definitely was an easier time for the government of the day because the numbers were there. As Peter said, it's all about the numbers, and when you can have that work to your favour in both houses. One thing I would say, and it's probably just a reflection looking at the new Labor government coming in now, we'd had 16 years in opposition, and a lot of the shadow ministers who became ministers had those portfolios for a while. A lot of work was done. There was a 100-day plan. There was a very strong legislative agenda. We were sitting 4 days a week, and quite a lot of sitting weeks, which I think Mick probably saw from opposition. But there was a plan and it was ready to go, and I think that the work had been done in opposition to implement, particularly in that first term of government when the numbers were so strong. And to not be super political, but I do see with the current government that they've had 12 years, they had 12 years in opposition and they were in, but I would argue that their legislative agenda hasn't been as strong or as previously worked on, I wouldn't say, to the time that we came in. So it's just been interesting to watch that change from both opposition to government, but to see what a new government does after their, I guess, predecessors had so long in power. So, but yeah, it was an interesting time.
Thank you. And Mark Latham, so you were elected to the Legislative Council in 2019, in some ways a little bit of a similar time in the electoral cycle to what Mick Veitch just described.
I suppose so. My first impressions were that nothing could ever be as bad as the 2004 federal election, which I lost as Leader of the Opposition. I remember Niall Blair on the address in reply. I think he had 4 instalments of a speech that got down to what his kids thought about it, what his dog thought about it, about the horror of being demonised on the ABC News because some fish washed up on that Menindee Lake when he was the water minister, and it was a real heart-wrenching sob story. And I remember turning to Rod Roberts and saying, you ought to try losing a national election and see what it's like. So all things are relative, aren't they, in life and politics? And I suppose in the upper house, there is that opportunity to pick your issues on the crossbench. You can't do everything. Probably the big change I've noticed following Sarah's remarks is the paucity of the Labor government agenda. It's really a parallel universe now where on government business days we'll go home at 6 p.m. It seemed to be a lot more active even in the last days of the former government. After 12 years, in their last year, they seem to have a bigger, more active, controversial legislative agenda than Labor coming into office in their first year. Now, I know politics is sort of narrowed and agendas aren't as reformist as they used to be, but you look at the new government and really the role of the Legislative Council has changed because the review of legislation is a lot narrower. The two big issues the government has currently are public sector wage increases without productivity trade-offs. Well, that's not something we're going to be involved in all that much. And the other one is housing supply, which is quite a surprising issue for a Labor government in a city like Sydney to fill the coffers of the land development and housing industry. But that's where they've headed, and that's their really big thing. And obviously I've been quite involved with the Rose Hill controversy, which seems to have spurred that agenda, and there was a lot of things to say about that. So, I think it's a matter of recognising that legislative scrutiny is not what it used to be in the upper house at the moment, and probably with the declining capacity of the commercial media to run scrutiny and integrity issues, there's probably a bigger role there, and the crossbench plays that. So our powers of SO 52, call for papers, budget estimates, which is unusual from Canberra. In Canberra, Paul Keating would have been horrified at the idea of lower house ministers having to appear at upper house budget estimates, unrepresentative swill, and he would have said, oh, it's a complete, absolute privilege that we'd ever do that. But it's a feature here, so budget estimates are important, question time to a lesser extent, and questions on the notice paper. So there are some forums, if you use them skillfully, you can make a difference in the upper house, and I suppose the best example of that currently is my colleague Rod Roberts, who is sort of the de facto shadow minister for police, where he seems to know more about what's happening in the police force than the minister, and has a good feed of information where he's raised a whole bunch of issues, integrity and scrutiny, that just points to that growing role on the crossbench.
I am conscious that we don't have a member of the current government here, so Mick Veitch, it's going to fall to you to defend the... all joking aside, Susan Carter, you arrived just last year. What was it like for you?
I think overwhelming. Interestingly, I, as a lecturer, had taught New South Wales Parliament, and so you think, well, I have some understanding of what it is that I'm walking into, but the theory is always very different to the practice. And every day I walk into the chamber, I feel this tremendous sense of privilege and almost that imposter syndrome of, why am I here? Well, if I'm here, I must make sure that I repay the trust that's been placed in me to do the best job that I possibly can. I think the other thing that's really struck me, David, is you focus on the work being in the chamber, but as Mark has indicated, a lot of the really important work in the upper house happens outside the chamber, happens in the committee system and happens in the estimates process. And it is extraordinary the amount of scrutiny that you are able to apply in the estimates process. And sadly, to pick up the theme of the day, also what's surprised me the most, I think, that's come out through the estimates process is perhaps the difficulty that the government's had to transition into the fact that, as well as passing laws, they have to manage the implementation of those laws. And there's often seemed to be, through that process, a really a lean understanding of what an implementation process looks like, so that laws aren't just passed, but they actually happen for the benefit of the people.
Mark Latham's talked about the role of the crossbench and the important role that the crossbench plays. I'm conscious that each of you have fulfilled a variety of roles in your time in Parliament, particularly those who have been in the Legislative Council for some time. Sarah Mitchell, can you talk us through what it's like to be a leader of a major political party and to be a senior minister in government? What's that experience like?
Well, look, first I'd say it's an incredible privilege, and I think anyone who gets to serve as a minister would agree. You have very, very challenging times, but then you can do something that might seem simple that's really rewarding. And, you know, I didn't expect to be Education Minister when we had 2 years of a global pandemic. That wasn't actually on my to-do list. So, but you learn a lot about how you can, I guess, work with teams and, you know, develop a skill set, which is quite unique. Like there's no job quite like what we do. And then when you get the opportunity to be a minister, I do think it adds another layer of complexity, but also privilege to it. I think too, like it's interesting, people sort of ask how the process goes and do you get a pick and do you get to say what you want? And the short answer is not really. When I first became a minister, I was Minister for Early Childhood and for Aboriginal Affairs, and I had just had my first daughter. I've had 2 girls since being an MP, and I was on my local early childhood sort of daycare committee, and I was really interested in that in a policy space. So that was sort of a natural fit for me to do something there. I did have to go off the committee, which the director was really happy I got promoted, but didn't like the fact that I'd have to find another mum to say yes to going onto a committee. But so that was sort of how that started, and then I ended up doing some assistant education work with Rob Stokes, and then was moved up into the education portfolio. But you literally get a phone call from, in my case, the Leader of the Nationals, and saying we would like you to be in the ministry and this is the role that we would like you to take on. And I think that you have to be quite adaptable. You know, reshuffles can happen, policy changes can come to you. There can be a media story in a portfolio like education that your whole day's direction can pivot literally from 6:30 in the morning of what you thought you were going to do to what you end up doing because of what might happen outside of your control. And I think in a parliamentary sense, obviously when you're a leader you have responsibility and a minister putting legislation through the House, negotiating on any bills that you might have, also dealing with Private Members' Day, which is also a really big thing in the Upper House. We have a full day where members will be, you know, doing calls for papers, passing motions, wanting to raise issues in your portfolio, and then also question time. There's, you know, preparation you need to do. You need to be thinking about what you might get asked about that day. So an amazing job, but it's a lot of work and it's very high stakes and can be high pressure at times too. But something that I'll always be grateful that I had the opportunity to do, because I know a lot of great people who serve in Parliament who never get that chance, and sometimes it's just the way that the cards fall, whether you get the phone call or not.
And Mick Veitch, you were on the other side of the table as a shadow minister while Sarah Mitchell was a minister, and of course Susan Carter, you're the new shadow minister. Sarah Mitchell, you're a shadow minister again. Tell us about being a shadow minister.
Yeah. I'm one of those ones that didn't get the chance.
You're the greatest ag minister that never was, I tell you.
So
true, I mean that.
For those that were here for Dr. Phelps's contribution earlier, he spoke about politics about the numbers. I didn't have the numbers, literally. 12 years in the front bench, and was appointed shadow minister in 2011 after the shellacking that we took, quite rightfully, a shellacking 4 years after we probably shouldn't have won. And I can remember John Robertson ringing me and saying, well, you're going to finish up on the front bench. Didn't really have a lot of idea around what a shadow minister should do or go about their work. So it was particularly a regional shadow minister. And I should put that in a little bit of context for those that aren't aware of just how big the shellacking was. So for 2 years, I was the only member of the Labor Party living west of the Dividing Range at a state and federal level in New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland. Just put that in context. So not only did I have to be a shadow minister and undertake the duties with a large range of portfolios, learn them, get my head around them with one staff member, but I also had to service the party, which meant I was doing a phenomenal amount of travelling to all parts of the eastern seaboard, essentially. And I sort of didn't really, 12 years as a front bencher, I missed out in 2023. I was the one minister, one shadow minister that didn't get elected in 23. So all the people around the table, congratulations, I missed out. I don't think I hit my feet as a shadow minister until about 2015, David, and then I'm sort of up against Niall Blair, and we developed a process, Niall and I, where we had some really good feisty debates, but we also, and again, Peter spoke about the capacity, a part of being a parliamentarian as opposed to a politician really, is being able to walk into a room, close the door and have a conversation with your opponent about, look, this is a good piece of legislation, but you've got some elements here that we're going to find egregious in the party room. We need to sort that out. Can we come to some sort of an agreement about that? And then working through what that would look like. And then by the time it hits the Parliament, you can actually have a very constructive debate around getting the legislation up rather than just saying no or knocking over something that in the longer term will be quite, has the potential to be quite important for the people of New South Wales. And it was there that I realised things like, the Standing Order 52 call for papers, which there weren't many in the 2015 period, by the way. The questions on notice, I do remember dropping 330 questions on notice on the one day onto the, and I do apologise to the staff, they're still nodding, post-traumatic stress. And Susan, I'm glad you really liked the budget estimates process because it wasn't like that in 2015. It wasn't like that at all. And as Dr. Phelps and I lobbied very hard for an extensive period of time to change it, but essentially the ministers would turn up for about 40 minutes. And then you would have the public servants for about 40 minutes, and then you'd move on to the next minister. That was it, which wasn't really conducive. So the model you have now evolved out of what was colloquially referred to as the committee into committees. It was a very, very parliamentary thing, by the way, very Legislative Council. And that devised, so it created a tool for opposition, particularly, and crossbench members, much better than what was available. So my time as a shadow minister in that 12 years, not only did I evolve and mature and I guess sophisticate my processes, but I realised the Parliament had to do the same, and so I actively engaged myself along with, reach across the chamber to people like Dr. Phelps or David Shoebridge, Robert Borzak, and have conversations about what can we do to improve the House of Review so it better serves the people of New South Wales. And that's where I did a body of my work.
Thank you. If I can take you all down that track of talking about committee work for a little while. Mark Latham, in the last term of Parliament, you were chair of Portfolio Committee number 3, which was dealing with education, at the same time as Sarah Mitchell was Minister for Education. Can you tell us a little bit about the work of your committee, how effective it was, what you were able to achieve? And then Sarah Mitchell, what it was like being on the other side of that equation.
Well, hopefully we gave her a very torrid time, and of course, like all ministers, didn't listen enough to the committee's findings and recommendations. That goes without saying. But the first thing that surprised me, and I think it is an ongoing issue for the upper house, was to find out that in writing a report about school education policy, to my surprise, I was the first chair in the upper house who actually wrote his own report. That the tradition ongoing is that the draft chair's report is essentially written by the staff. Now, some of these issues are so complex and at times confusing in the evidence you receive. I think sort of the accuracy of evidence is another emerging issue for us. People come to these committees now thinking, oh, they're all politicians who just lie, why shouldn't I lie as well? And if you're not getting accurate committee evidence, how can you make accurate findings and recommendations? So I wrote the report about school education, which again I think reflected on something that's fading. It was essentially evidence-based because schools are critically important. I've always had a long-standing interest. I'm only here because of a good public school education. And the first in my family to go to university and so forth. But the thing about the education debate, which is often pitched left versus right, public versus private and so forth, control of the Teachers' Federation, is that right around the world, in every single jurisdiction, schools have been studied thousands of times collectively. There's no new findings in education. The evidence is clear as to what works in the classroom. So why do we even have a debate? So the reports we did in that area, some stuff on tertiary education, some stuff on the parental rights in the school system, but particularly that first report on school policy reform, which I wrote and the committee by and large adopted, was about an evidence base. I think Peter Phelps spoke about evidence base in politics. Unfortunately, it is fading. One of the reasons is that with the rise of social media, so much of what we do is within an echo chamber, and it's got to be self-criticism on the crossbench, clearly. To tell your supporters what they want to hear on social media is a big part of the game. And the echo chamber means that you get people speaking from ideology rather than practical evidence-based policy outcomes. So I don't know how Sarah saw it. Hopefully it was uncomfortable for her at times, I'm sure it was. But from a committee perspective, I think the big things for the upper house now are the reliability of evidence, more chairs actually writing the material, because it's very unfair on the Secretariat staff in these complex, detailed areas to expect them to be across the brief, as well as an MP should be. It should be a fundamental public duty of an MP. And then to have these reports as evidence-based as possible and useful for government and even future generations. I always thought about some of that stuff we did in the Education Committee, that 10 years from now a new MP could pick up those reports, if they could dust them off, and actually find some useful information that would inform their own work. And I know I'm a bit long-winded here, but just one final point, the value of specialisation. With the rise of social media, every MP knows 2% about everything. And you've lost the policy experts. I remember when I joined the federal parliament, you look at Robert Ray, you look at John Kerrin, you look at Ralph Willis and see experts in defence, agriculture, economics, and you've lost that depth of public policy knowledge and attention in MPs. So the committee system needs to foster that as much as possible.
Look, Mark Latham in full flight is something to be seen, I have to say. And being in particularly in budget estimates, yeah, I mean, I think there were times when we would agree and there were times when we wouldn't, but it was always, from my perspective, respectful. And I think, Mark made a good point in relation to that policy subject matter, because it was very clear, and it still is, Mark, that you're highly intelligent, you know a lot about education policy, you're well read and well researched, and that would come through in the questions and the way that you would frame that work. We didn't always agree.
You never said that at the time.
Well, I don't think you said that about me either, but we can do it now. Oh. We're not in the roles anymore. No, it's true. I mean, I don't agree with a lot of your views, but I respect the way that you research and know what you want to put out there. And I think that, and that's something that you do see across the parliament, really. You can be completely, opposing views in terms of your policy, but actually have quite a cordial working relationship, even if that's not always evident. And that's how I would see it. I think, I won't name names, but without doubt, some of the public servants were terrified of you in estimates as well. But I think that the role of, as I said, having a chair of a committee who was very passionate, there were some good recommendations that came out of that we were able to use when we were in government. And I think that if you, for me too, being an upper house member, knowing the personalities, knowing who was on the committee, when you're an upper house member and a minister, you still, prepare for estimates and you think about what might be asked and all of that sort of thing. But you know the players and you know what people are interested in, you know sort of what their core issues are. And I find it interesting now on the other side, watching some of the lower house ministers come who think that our chamber is similar to theirs or think that they can get away with not answering. That's not how estimates works. And so when you know the nuances of the personalities, you know the things that people are interested in, I do think there's a strength being an upper house minister in a committee hearing or an estimates process just because of those relationships that are formed. And, I know that Mark was very passionate about evidence-based and that sort of work. I know he was the kind of member who would take the time to literally read individual school reports to ask very in-depth questions about things like targets and accountability. And so when you sort of know the style of one of your colleagues in the areas that you're interested in, I think that does sort of help you to work through that process. But like I said, we didn't agree and we still don't on some things. But at the end of the day, you should be able to walk out and get in the lift and have a chat and go and knock on a door if you need to. And I would say that that's the relationship, by and large, that all upper house members really have with each other, whether they're committee chairs or ministers or anything in between.
Mick Veitch, during the last term of Parliament, you were chair of a very particular committee. Tell us a little bit about that and why was it important?
Oh, David, how long have we... So Dr Phelps and I, again, our lovely committee into committees, decided that the Legislation Review Committee of the Parliament was not spending enough time looking upon the regulations that were being put in place. Now, there's the legislation that goes through the Parliament. Regulation, of course, is decreed by ministers under a clause of an act to allow them to do it, delegated legislation. And there's more and more of that, just so you know. I think the numbers were 85 or 87% in 1 year of legislation or regulation was all regulation. And so the scrutiny of those regulations is really important to all of you. And so we decided that regulation required a specific committee just to focus on the regulations. And so we set up the Regulation Committee, David. And so I think probably to the consternation of our lower house colleagues. And so I chaired that committee. It was a great committee because, and to chair it at the sort of the commencement, also pretty critical because it shapes the way in which the committee will operate into the future. And we had a couple of options we could look at, and we did. When a disallowance motion was moved on a particular regulation, we decided we could lift that regulation up, take it to this committee for an inquiry, and have the inquiry, and then have the debate reinstated when the report was tabled. So rather than go straight into a debate around whether or not the regulation should be disallowed or a part of the regulation, it better informed the debate in the Parliament in the chamber around that. We did a couple of those. We conducted a couple of those inquiries. And then the committee decided that, well, probably not the committee, but those who advised the committee probably were very instrumental, David, in the committee actually looking at some policy work. And we conducted a couple of inquiries, one around delegated authority, what it looked like in New South Wales, and what role the committee actually had, which led to changes to the standing orders and the committee, the capacity of the committee to conduct, the Regulation Committee to conduct its inquiries. But then we also looked at things like the instruments, so, you know, legislation, regulation, and which are disallowable, so it can come before the Parliament. But then matters of instruments like SEPs, for instance, State Environmental Planning Policy, that doesn't get before the Parliament. So we looked at whether or not the Regulation Committee could actually pick up some of those instruments and have a look at them to see what the consultation process was, how they come about, could they be improved, that sort of thing. So we sort of evolved the work of the Regulation Committee, and I do from time to time, David, I know you'll be very happy to hear this, have a look at the work of the Regulation Committee as it is now operating. I think it's maturing into, it's heading in the path I think that we had envisaged, but I think it's a very important committee, mainly because of the amount of government or governance that takes place now in the delegated legislative area.
Susan Carter, you're a member of that committee. Would you like to add a comment about sort of recent events?
Yeah, I think, picking up on what Mick said, there is an enormous volume of delegated legislation, and it's often seen by ministers and departments as being an efficient way to get things done. You just put the regulation out, you know what you want, you don't have to worry about getting it through Parliament, and the world works more smoothly. But of course, the review process that is inherent in a democratic system doesn't work more smoothly unless there is a review process. And I think what the Regulation Committee is doing is driving really interesting cultural change, because the practice is essentially, if an issue is identified with regulations, to write to the minister to advise what the issues are, to seek their comments on that. And when those letters started going out, that was a bit of a shock to some people, but it's been really good because it's created a dialogue and it's created a greater awareness of the role of the executive, that's the ministers, the role of Parliament, and essentially reminding the ministers that it is Parliament's obligation on behalf of the people to be reviewing the regulations. They must be made according to, within power, according to certain set processes, and I think it's driving a really good cultural change.
Thank you very much. We've got about 20 minutes now. I thought I might open it up to all of you, our excellent audience, for questions. And we have an immediate question down the front. Do we have some roving mics? Yes, there's one on the way from Emily. If anyone else has a question to ask, start framing those and we'll get the microphone to you next.
Hello. I just wanted to raise the issue of why, having listened to this morning's and this afternoon's sessions in relation to the composition of people who vote for government, we have heard nothing of the date at which voting rights were extended to Aboriginal people and what the implication of that might be and how late they were. And I ask that question in the context of Justice Jago's advice when she was chair of the National Native Title Tribunal to the then New South Wales Attorney General that it was important that New South Wales change its threefold criteria for the recognition of traditional custodians or for the recognition of native title, because it requires the traditional custodians not only to be descendants of those who were dispossessed from country, but also to have continued to live on country and to have continued their traditional practices, whatever that means in the current context. Justice Jago is now at the National, is now a judge in the National Court, but I wonder why her response and the impact that was requested of the New South Wales government to review that has not been addressed since it was made, and why the New South Wales government, under the last Liberal government, formed an accord not with the traditional custodians, who are hard to find a generalised representation, but an accord with the land councils that say that if the traditional custodians do not hold native title rights, which is a gift of the Parliament, then the land councils speak for the traditional custodians, which is a particular problem on the Central Coast where I live, where there is no native title, and the land councils say that the traditional custodians never existed. Thank you.
Would any members of the panel like to respond to that?
I'll have a
But
go.
can I also, perhaps we might get a response from Anthony Green on the issue of voting rights and exactly when Aboriginal people in New South Wales had the right to vote.
I've had a joint role agreement with the Commonwealth for a long time. It would have been in the late 1950s, in my memory. Sorry. It would be in the late 1950s, is my memory. But at Federation, the only Indigenous people in South Australia had the right to vote, and that was removed by the first Electoral Act, probably unconstitutionally, but there was no High Court at that stage. That's about all I can say answer that.
Okay. Would any members of the panel like to?
I'll just say a couple of things, and I don't pretend to be an expert in the complexities, only knowing that I was Minister for Aboriginal Affairs for 2 years here in New South Wales, and fully across the challenges to do with native title land rights. And they were there long before I was the Minister, and they continue today. What I would say, though, is that yes, there are sort of formal arrangements between the government of the day and the land councils, and that's obviously through things like the Land Rights Act. But that doesn't mean that that's the only engagement that you have, particularly as a minister or even as members of Parliament. With members of the Aboriginal community, you meet quite regularly with lots of different people in different communities, and in some groups the Land Council will be the most active in some areas. In others it might be other organisations of elders as well. And so even though there might be formal arrangements with certain organisations, that doesn't preclude work and conversations with a range of key stakeholders. And I think certainly during my time, I guess one of the most profound things that we did here in this Parliament was the passing of the Aboriginal Languages Act, and we had a really incredible day. And I know Mick was there and David would remember it as well. We had elders here on the floor of Parliament speaking in language. We had a message stick that was presented to the upper house, which remains on display, which we put on the table when we're having debate around legislation that has a particular impact on Aboriginal people as well. So I guess what I would say in answer to a very complex question is that dialogue is ongoing, that respect is certainly there regardless of which party is in power, and that work with the Aboriginal communities continues as it needs to do, because clearly there's more work that needs to happen, but that's probably about all I can offer. Yeah.
Do we have another question? Yes, Janelle. Oh.
We've talked about a lot of the really positive things about the Legislative Council, and there are many. Aside from returning Mr Veitch to the council, which will definitely improve the council, what are some of the things that you would like to see happen to improve it, or that sort of might take it further again into the future?
It's a good question. Can I just say one of the things that happened in my time, COVID actually changed the way, I think it in a way drug the Legislative Council into the modern age. So we started having hybrid sessions of Parliament and the like, and committees, and I still have post-traumatic stress about using WebEx, but that's a whole other matter. So which then availed sort of greater, particularly the regional MPs, we were able to fulfil our obligations from home or from wherever we were in regional New South Wales. We didn't have to keep coming to this building, so we weren't anchored, so to speak. So I think there was a change. Building on that, one of the things about Parliament and being a parliamentarian is trying to raise awareness of the activity and the work of an MP and the Parliament as a whole with a broad range of stakeholders, letting them just as an educative process. And I think the Parliament making efforts, particularly the committee system, the committees when they travel out into the regions or wherever, trying to meet with a range of different stakeholder groups, whether it be the schools, but trying to taking the committee process to the people, getting people engaged in the process, I think is a good thing, or at least being aware of what that process is, because it's, this way people can engage, one of the ways people can engage with the Parliament. And I think the other thing, Janelle, is this is one of the few occupations where you get elected without a lot of training. Seriously, it's and there's that's good and has its failings. I think one of the things that could help a lot is just providing greater information around what is the role of an MLC, because most people, and I'm being generous, but most people have absolutely no idea what a member of the Legislative Council would do on a day-to-day basis. And I think raising that awareness amongst the community would actually help the body politic as a whole.
So other members?
Look, I'm of the opinion that nothing much sensible happens after midnight, and that includes debating legislation. We have a hard adjournment at 10:30, which means having started typically the parliamentary day at 10, we will sit no later than 10:30. I'm pretty new. I've seen that. I've been here till 6 a.m. I've started a new sitting day, having finished at 10:30 at a minute past midnight. I'm not sure that that's really the way that really good decision making happens. So it'd be great to see something happen in terms of understanding that this is very serious work that needs consideration, and if people have had a good sleep, they'll do it a lot better.
I would say the introduction of timed speeches, that happened during my time. We used to have sort of open-ended, and there were some members that spoke 5-6 hours for single contribution. So the 20-minute cut-off, I think, was a good thing to bring in. And I sort of agree to Susan's point. It does reach a time, particularly when you are here very late. When I first got in, you would go through all through the night into all hours of the morning and be back here again, and it isn't very conducive to sort of.
We sat on weekends.
Yeah, we did. We had a big legislative agenda. That's why. But you're right. Like it's not conducive to sort of that clear thinking. And then to pick up on Mick's point, I would agree. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times that I'll be in the supermarket at home and people go, oh, how's Canberra? And often it's easier just to say, oh yeah, good, thanks. Because it's like, by the time you explain what you do and that you're not the local MP, but you're kind of like the Senate, but we're not called the Senate, you know, your milk and your eggs will go bad. So it's easier just to smile and nod sometimes. But I do think, and Janelle, you'll probably hate me for saying this, but the work that the Parliament has done this year, and I know it's the bicentenary year of the Legislative Council, and I do want to mention the President who's sitting quietly up the back there, Ben Franklin, but the engagement out in the community, having school kids involved, doing public speaking, coming down here, panel sessions like this. We've had some amazing events this year, all thanks to the hard work of people in this room. And I know when I say, let's do this every year, you'll say no. But I do think there are things that we have learned in terms of that interaction that hopefully we can build on as a parliament going forward that just worked and made people more aware, particularly what the Legislative Council does, because people know their local member, kind of, they might see them occasionally, they've got to vote for them by name. We're a bit more of an enigma, and like I said, most people think that I work in Canberra. So.
Well, my mother still asks me, how am I going in Canberra?
Oh, that's good.
But she's 90 years of age, you know, in a very fine nursing home. So, Sarah, you're not alone in that regard, and sometimes it's close to home. If I can nominate a few things, I think in terms of accountability and scrutiny of the executive government, particularly on integrity issues, the time's coming where we have to enforce our own rules. We don't, as a chamber, despite 200 years of history, have any penalties for a contempt of the chamber. I know there's been an historic disagreement between two chambers. I think that needs to be revisited. It's 40 or 50 years since we've enforced the rule about wilfully misleading the Parliament or a committee, which is a growing problem for the reasons I mentioned earlier on. And that one I started with, that there should be an expectation that committees write their own reports, particularly in complex, detailed areas. And also a mechanism, you know, this integrity dance we have, every opposition promises much higher standards of integrity. As soon as they get into government, that's forgotten. And some of the answers or non-answers we're getting on the notice paper at the moment are the worst ever. And we need some mechanism for holding the executive government to better account on that front.
Any other questions? Yes.
I guess just to the education ministers on the panel. So you mentioned that schools have been studied a lot and, you know, what works in the classroom is very clear. During COVID, did you see that those goals and what worked in the classroom was still the same? Or did that have to change? Or was it just like a need for adaptation with the circumstance?
Good question. Look, it's really interesting looking back now at that period of time, and the decisions that were made were absolutely made with the best interests at heart, with the best health advice. I was part of it. I don't know if I'm allowed to say too much about this, so I probably should get myself into trouble. But although I'm in opposition now, it doesn't really matter. I was part of like a smaller group of ministers and the Premier who would get pretty intense briefings from health experts about what we were seeing here, but also around the world. And so trying to really negotiate something that had never been done before was hard. And I know obviously there's been a sort of federal report recently looking into some of the decisions around COVID. The SMH did a piece not long ago specifically about education and COVID and what we did and all the things we did wrong. But no one else was in those rooms making those decisions based on the evidence that we had. And, you know, I was very, very conscious of the need to have the best opportunities for continuity in education that we could. And part of the reason why we went to learning from home was a lot of parents were keeping their children at home. So very early on, before the vaccine was available, you know, as a mum or a dad, often you think that your kids are the first to pick up anything that goes around the school playground. So we didn't have enough young people coming to school, and we thought we need to find a way to manage that. And so the way that department and the teachers, who were phenomenal, managed to then move everything to some form of learning remotely, whether it was online, some using correspondence, a bit of a combination. Was it perfect? No. but we made it through. We found opportunities to get people back as quickly as we could. Part of the challenge was actually not about the students, it was about parents at the school gate or teachers interacting and the impact that that would have. I found out during that period a lot of teachers are either married or in relationships, because one would go down, then the other one would go down, or some were flatmates, and so you'd have this whole sort of flow-on effect if people in the community had COVID. So I could talk about this all day, and I won't, because I know that's not what we're here to do, but I guess the purpose was that it was about trying to be make the best evidence-based decisions that we could based on health, but also the social impacts. And I do think that there will be, you know, some challenges going forward for a little while as kids got back into getting into routine. And part of it was actually about making sure that you had that emotional and wellbeing support around, as well as the academic as well. Like, it was not fun. I would not advocate for trying to have a global pandemic and run the biggest education system in the Southern Hemisphere. It was hard. But I, to this day, hand on heart, say we made the best decisions that we could based on the best evidence, including both health and that social interaction as well. So, but it's crazy when you think back about it now. But yeah. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Apologies, I have to go, but thank you very much.
Well, on that note, can I ask everyone to thank Susan Carter as she leaves? And I think that's actually brought our program for today to a close. Can I ask you to thank our other panel members, Mick Veitch, Sarah Mitchell and Mark Latham.